We have the promise made that Satan would strike the seed of woman's heel, but that seed of woman we know to be Jesus Christ would crush Satan's head. And then chapters 6 through 9 are about the flood that came in Noah's day. And then chapter 11 was the Tower of Babel. In between that, chapters 4, 5, and 10 are largely chapters about the genealogies of the people. So when we got done with that, then what did we have after that, following these things? It's Abraham. And of course, there's the story of Abraham, his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob. And of course, there's other people mixed in there. There's Abraham's wife Sarah, and then then there's Isaac, and then his wife Rebekah, and they had two sons, Jacob and Esau. But Jacob was the one that the lineage would come through. And then there was Jacob's 12 sons, and one of those sons being Joseph, and that's the son that was sold into slavery. That was the son that brought them down to Egypt after he became the leader of the nation and saved the people from the famine and the drought. And so they were able to be now into the land of Egypt. So after that time, about 400 years go by, and they become slaves. And then someone else is brought up, Moses. And Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt. And in so doing, he did that by way of God through the 10 plagues that were brought upon the Egyptians. And they spent approximately 40 years wandering in the wilderness. While wandering, they flipped the generation of adults that came out of Egypt all died off. And only Joshua and Caleb were able to go into the promised land. They built the tabernacle while they were gone. They received the law of Moses and did that over that 40 years. That covered the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. What was next after that is the book of Joshua. And the book of Joshua, it covers only just a very few years, around 7 or 8 years, in which they conquered the promised land and divided and settled up the land. After that, ushers in a period of 400 years of judges, and those judges come about and they lead the people. The people would sin, and when they would sin, God would punish them by sending a nation to punish them. And when that nation was oppressing them, they would cry out to God, seeking God's deliverance, and God would send a judge, and that judge would rescue them and lead them out of the peril they were in. And then a few years would go by, and then they would sin again, and the cycle went around again and again. And it took place during the period of the Judges. Another book that took place during the period of the Judges was the little book of Ruth, which took place toward the end of the period of the Judges. At the end of the Judges, the last one of the judges was Samuel. And Samuel anointed the first two kings. He anointed Saul and then later on David. The United Kingdom is the time period that is described by the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon. At Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam became king. Rehoboam chose poorly and decided to listen to the younger men and decided to not reduce the burden of the people. Instead, he said he was going to raise their taxes and make it more difficult for them. And the result of that is that 10 of the tribes left. Only Judah and Benjamin stayed with Rehoboam. And so from then on, the kingdom was divided. Jeroboam immediately set up golden calves at Dan and Bethel. And Jeroboam was the first king of the north. And immediately from that day forward, the northern kingdom became idol worshippers. There were no good kings in the north. None of them were righteous. None of them did what was right in God's eyes. The few people that did want to do what was right, the Levites and some others, they packed up and they went down to the other two tribes. But for the most part, the northern kingdom became idolatrous and wicked from day one. What resulted a little later on is that the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by the Assyrians, and they were scattered and resettled. They intermarried with the other nations because of the scattering that they went through. And by the time we come to the New Testament, they are a nation of people we know as the Samaritans. And they are the ones that we see in the New Testament. The southern kingdom was taken by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. They were allowed to return after the Babylonians were overthrown by the Medo-Persian Empire, and King Cyrus, a Persian king, one of his great things is he let a lot of the nations that the Babylonians had captured go back home, and even helped fund the role for them to do that. And so he decreed that they would go back and resettle Jerusalem and Judah and the area around it. And so many went back, around 50,000 or so went back. Included among them was Ezra. Ezra went back and he began and led them to build the temple and led them to begin the worship there in Jerusalem. Nehemiah was sent later on by a later king, Artaxerxes, and he was able to go back because of that king allowed him to go because he wanted to rebuild the wall around the city. And then lastly, at the end of Ezra and Nehemiah and after their time, about 400 years more go by, and then that's time when Jesus is born. And so very quickly, that's the entire history of the Old Testament, at least summarized. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you. There you go. Okay. So, anyway, I'm going to work on that PowerPoint more, maybe to make it a little better. For our study tonight, the books that we're looking at are the books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Each one of these books could undoubtedly be an entire study. A book like Psalms we could spend a year or two on by itself. But some of the things about them, in looking at them, they are the books known as the poetry books. They're also called books of wisdom or wisdom literature. And poetry and wisdom literature is different from, say, something that would be described as prose or a narrative. Wisdom literature gives what generally are called truisms. You will look at the Proverbs, and you will look at those, and you'll say, well, that might be true, but it's not always true. And that is exactly the way it amounts to. Not all things contained in the Proverbs or such are things that are true in all circumstances. But yet, you are way better off if you follow the guidance that's in them. There's a very big difference between the Proverbs and the Psalms and what they're saying, and then you go to something like, say, Leviticus or Deuteronomy that's giving a straightforward command of what to do. And so we look at things differently based on what kind of literature it is, and certainly that's the case with like something that's declarative like Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy versus something like Job. Well, it's poetry, and yet there's a lot of things in it. There's just an absolute gold mine of things in these books to get, to learn, to understand. The book of Job is a fascinating book. The book of Job, of course, is basically a story. It's a story of a man who lived in the ancient East. The time frame of the book of Job, by most accounts, puts Job somewhere in the time probably between the Tower of Babel and Abraham, or at least somewhere in that neighborhood. Maybe as a contemporary of Abraham or somewhere. But he was a wealthy man of the East, is what he's called in the beginning. That's what Abraham would have been called also. Abraham came from the east, from Ur, from what is right near Babylon. in what is modern-day Iraq. And so chances are that Job was from that similar area. But Job, in the way that the book is presented, the way that he communicates with God, and all the things associated with that, are like the way it was during the time of the patriarchs, like when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived. The book of Job, although a story, is very much poetry. And when you look at the way that it goes, there is the prologue, the first couple chapters, which is essentially the story. But the majority of the book, chapters 3 all the way through 42, are basically a bunch of speeches. Job's friends, each in turn, would speak. And then right after that, well, that reminds me to turn mine on vibrate too. Good idea. And if you don't have yours on vibrate, it reminds you to do as well. But it's a whole section of speeches. One of his friends would speak, and then Job would speak. And then another friend spoke, and then Job would speak. And they did that in turn, and did that in rotation. And largely, the friends basically, and I say, you're looking at 39 chapters, so there's a lot more to it than just this. But basically, the friends said, you must have done something really bad to get God mad at you. And Job maintains his innocence, maintains that he's righteous before God, maintains that he's done nothing wrong, maintains that, I don't know what's going on. And at the end, there is a section at the end, toward the end of it, that God speaks. In chapters 38 through 42, the friends all speak, and the friends all basically say foolishness. It's interesting, with the wisest of the friends is the youngest friend, the fourth friend that comes along later. He actually speaks the best sense of all of them. But he's Elihu in chapters 32 to 37. But Elihu speaks, and he has more sense than the rest of them. But God's the one that finally comes in and clears it all up. And after there is 34 chapters of Job and his friends analyzing what's going wrong in Job's life, God comes in and says, I don't remember consulting you when I created the heavens and the earth. Where were you when I designed all this? Very much put Job in his place. If you've never read the book, read the first couple chapters, and then if you want to read some of the speeches, but especially if you've never read it, and if you just read the interaction between Job and God, it is some precious, precious text. And just if you've never done that, read those last 4 chapters there of Job, and it's just really, really awesome stuff to see how Job is interacting one-on-one with God. The end of the result is that Job gets everything back, doubled what he had, and he has 10 more children, and is blessed beyond measure because he stayed faithful. Job tackles the toughest question probably in all of human history. And that is, why do righteous people suffer right along with the wicked? If there's a tougher question than that, I don't know what it is. But it comes down to this. And what it amounts to is that, being in this world, living in this world, you're going to encounter the good and the bad. It's there. And it's a part of it. Job went through the good, and then Job went through the bad, and then Job was blessed with the good once again because he was faithful to God. And for me, probably the best way to illustrate it that we can understand and identify with is, why would anybody want to have a child? You have a child, and you know that child is going to hurt. That child is going to have days that they're going to cry tears. That child is going to go through some heartaches and difficulties. they're going to get a bad grade on a test. They're going to fall and skin up their knees. They're probably going to have somebody they love very dear die. They're going to have struggles. But you know what? We have children because that's not all there is to it, is there? Because there's love, there's hope, there's joy. They're able to live a life. We want to have the opportunity to help somebody have a life and live a good life. We have children knowing full well that they're going to encounter difficulty and pain and suffering and challenges. And it's a lot the way God deals with us. We are a part of this earth, even with all of the negative things, but yet there's the positive that's in there. And so God created us to be able to live in this world, to be a part of this world, and yet knowing there's good, knowing there's bad. But those that hold true to the Lord, like Job, will reap the benefits and reap the rewards that come from that. The book of Psalms. Wow, what can you say about the book of Psalms in about 5 minutes? The book of Psalms was the Hebrew songbook. We attribute David as the author, but really only David wrote the biggest portion of them. There are quite a few psalms written by other people. On page 128, there's some of those people listed. There are a lot of psalms written by Korah, or the sons of Korah. And then there are psalms written by Asaph. And then there's some also written by the sons of Korah also again. There's one written by Solomon, one written by Moses, and there's a few others that are just untagged that we don't know. But David wrote the most. And so there are those scattered throughout. The most famous and beloved ones are David's. On the outline, we get a chance to look at in a little while. What I did was, I thought, okay, what do I want to do for this week for an outline? And what I did was I came up with this is my list, and that's all it is. My list of some of the most impactful psalms, and listing a couple things, usually a line or two about them. But this is what I said for the 23rd Psalm. This is probably the best known and beloved text in all of human history. And if I'm wrong in that, tell me what is more loved and recognized than the 23rd Psalm. I think we could argue that there are some texts in the New Testament that are more important to our salvation. But if you're taking texts just based upon what we love and what is appreciated by and recognized by humanity around the globe, you'd be hard-pressed to find something more impactful than the 23rd Psalm. The Psalms are special. What I love about the Psalms, what I love about David's writing in particular, is that for whatever reason, David, because of his meditation, David, because of his relationship with God and having a heart after God, David's writing is the most like the New Testament of anything else in the Old Testament you'll find. You follow what I'm saying there? The language he uses about grace and mercy and forgiveness and salvation, and the words that he uses, a lot of the words that David frequently uses are rarely used in the Old Testament, except for when David writes. And so David really writes some things that are especially powerful. In fact, in the New Testament, the most quoted book is the Psalms. Isaiah is number 2. But the Psalms is the most quoted book in the New Testament. And so it impacted that. We think of David as being a king, but David was very much one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. We don't usually label him as a prophet, but he was. In particular, some of the Psalms have very much to do with Jesus. They're called Messianic Psalms, and you find them throughout the Psalms. Probably the best well-known is the 22nd Psalm, which begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Well, you remember that, don't you? what Jesus said on the cross. In that very same psalm, it says that, about his body being like wax and none of his bones broken, that his garment would be divided and cast lots to buy it. And it's just, you read Psalm 22 and you think, okay, it's almost like God went as a checklist. Okay, when you come to Jesus' crucifixion, and all these prophecies there in Psalm 22 are just straight down the line with what happens. And certainly it was not a coincidence at all. The Psalms emphasize prayer and praise to God. Do you realize there are 5 books? They have the 5 books listed on page 128, and you might argue those are 5 separate books. They're always categorized together, but they are 5 books as far as they go. They are separate collections and different themes, basically, and different authors. The book of Proverbs is a collection of some of Solomon's Proverbs. Solomon is attributed in 1 Kings 4:32 to have authored over 3,000 Proverbs. There's not 3,000 Proverbs in the book of Proverbs. There's quite a few, and I don't know if anybody's counted them. Oh, probably somebody's counted them, but I'm not going to be the one to count them. There's a bunch of them, but there's not 3,000. We have quite a few recorded. The book of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters, are largely written from the perspective of a father writing to his son, in which he personifies the wisdom and describes wisdom as a woman, and that's what personification means. You make an inanimate object or concept into a person, and we can discuss that. I prefer not to, but yes, wisdom was a woman, and so. But also temptation was a woman too in that same text, so just be careful. But wisdom was a woman, I'll give you that, and temptation was too. The Proverbs, for the most of the rest of the book, are simply general Proverbs. Proverbs 30 and 31 are written by other individuals. Lemuel and Agur, they were a couple individuals that wrote some Proverbs at the end. King Lemuel is the one that wrote 31, the one about a virtuous woman, and of course that's a really powerful one. And 30 is written by Agur of Jacob. Any questions or comments so far? I've kind of blitzed through these. Got 2 more books to look at. Ecclesiastes is written largely, as you might say, as Solomon's search for happiness. It's really, quite frankly, a depressing book for almost all but the last couple verses. There's the phrase that keeps coming up is vanity of vanities. Or as the NIV says, meaningless, meaningless. It's all chasing after the sun. That's in that text. Chasing after the wind. That's in the same in that book. Those 2 things are a part of our culture. If you say you're chasing after the wind or chasing after the sun, it means you're wasting your time. You're not going to catch it. Those are 2 things that come out of Ecclesiastes. Some of you that are, of course, I know the song, but some that are a little older might remember the song that was out in the 60s by the Byrds, Turn, Turn, Turn. To everything there is a season. It was based off of Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. And that's where that came from. But the book is all about his search for happiness, and he doesn't find it. You come to the end of the book, in verse 12, 13, it says, to fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. You remember last Sunday night when we did our lesson about Solomon, and my conclusion and my hope is that 12:13 was written at the end of his life, and that he maybe realized some of the foolishness of what he had done earlier, and maybe that's a repentance on his part at the end of his life for the way that he had turned away to idolatry and other things in the course of that time. But anyway, the other probably most notable passage in the book of Ecclesiastes is probably Ecclesiastes 12 verse 1. Does anyone remember what that says? Yeah, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Yeah, that's the passage. Remember the Creator in the days of your youth. And the point is to start out well. Start out well, and remember God at the beginning, because you'll not stray from that. Or if you do, you'll come back to it as you get older. The last book that we're looking at this evening is the Song of Solomon. And Song of Solomon is a rather mature book. It's written about romantic love between a man and a woman. And the Song of Solomon is very much a love story. It is about, sexual love and the relationship that Solomon and one of his wives had. We kind of assume that Solomon is the main character in it, but certainly he wrote it. But it is about a young couple and their love for each other. It is a beautiful picture of that love and the expression of that love to and toward each other. And certainly there's a lot of good things there for certainly mature audiences to appreciate. Any questions or comments about the 5 books of poetry? Okay, now let's go to the questions. I think we're doing okay on time, so we'll do the what did we learn from this section. Let's all do this together, and then I'll do the fill in the blanks. I'll ask the younger ones to do that. So number 1, David. Which one is he? D, the author of most of the Psalms. Number 2, Satan. Okay, the antagonist in the story of Job, who takes away Job's wealth and health. All right. Number 3, a proverb. L, it is a short but wise saying. Number 4, the fear of the Lord. F, the main theme of the book of Proverbs. Okay. Number 5, Solomon. J, which is the author of over 3,000 Proverbs. A lyre is a musical instrument that David learned to play as a young man. It is often called a harp, depending on the translation that you use. And a lyre it's the little difference between a lyre and a harp, and probably it probably really was a lyre. A lyre was something usually you would hold in your arm, but it was very much like a harp and used like that. It's a picture of a lyre on page 128 is what basically they look like. A harp was usually the really big thing that you would not carry, but you would stand next to and play it. A lyre could be something that a person could play and actually walk, march or carry it wherever they went. So that's typically the difference of those. Number 7, Job. C, a man who faithfully served God even though he suffered the loss of his possessions, family, and health. Number 8, Asaph. G, the author of a collection of 17 Psalms. All right. Under the sun, number 9. I, a recurring phrase that appears throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Messianic. H, term used to describe certain Old Testament statements that anticipate something about the life of Christ. And some of the Psalms are called that, the Messianic Psalms. Number 11, a Psalm. B, a song of praise to God. And number 12, Song of Solomon. E, a work of literature that poetically describes the sexual relationship between a man and a woman. All right? Number 1, fill in the blanks. Describe in your own words the difference between poetry and prose. Stephen? You don't know? You just want to have your hand raised up? Oh, okay. You know what the difference between poetry and prose is? Okay, that is a tougher question. One of the adults want to help? Okay, prose is a narrative. Prose is essentially a story. Okay? A newspaper article would be prose. The story of David and Goliath would be prose. Poetry, it doesn't necessarily follow a logical order. There's not a story even to be told. It's giving something, it's describing it in other terms. And so prose, largely a story. Just think story with prose, and you'll be right on. Fancy words, narrative, but it's a story. Number 2, when a copy of the New Testament is published without the Old Testament, which of the 5 books of wisdom are typically included? Stephen? Psalms, yes. They give you 3 lines to write Psalms, don't they? In there. And I've seen Bibles with Proverbs added too. I've got one that I've got a waterproof Bible. The pages are waterproof. You can dunk it. I don't play with it like that, but you can get it wet and it dries out. But anyway, it's got Psalms and Proverbs in it. Some of you look like you've never seen a waterproof Bible. It's really cool. It really is. Made a map It's made a map things. It's made for like taking hiking and hunting and fishing and backpacking and stuff. I'll bring it and show it to you if you want. If some of you are interested in that. Why did Job's 3 friends hardly recognize him when they came to see him? Stephen?
Because of the terrible case of boils Satan struck with.
Yeah, he's got boils. He's covered from head to toe in ashes, and he doesn't feel well. They don't recognize him at all because of that. What is a messianic psalm? Okay, it's a prophecy about Jesus. Okay, in Psalm 51:7, David said to God, "Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow." By using this figurative language, what do you think what he was asking God to do for him? Yeah, forgiving him of his sins. That category was harder than I thought it was. Sorry, kids. You can give some of these answers here. Which author wrote the most Psalms? Caden. A. David, right. Number 2, what is a proverb? Brody. What was it? D, yes. I couldn't tell whether he said B or D. I hoped you'd said D. And surely nobody said a cooking recipe. Solomon is credited with having written how many proverbs in his lifetime? Francie? D, 3,000. Okay. The book of Ecclesiastes seeks to answer what question? Caden? B, what is the meaning of life? Okay, yeah. All right. What is the Song of Solomon about? What is it about, Caden? A. Human sexual life, yes. Which book of poetry does not include anything written by Solomon? Brody? A. Job. Yep. All right. Okay, discussion questions. What are the implications of Job physically suffering so terribly even while living a moral life?
God promises to save us from spiritual pain, not physical.
Right. God promises to save us from spiritual pain, not physical pain. That's good. I like that. It rains on the just and the unjust, like Jesus said. Yeah. That those things happen to both. The body deteriorates. You know, if this world wasn't perfect, we wouldn't want to go to the one we're looking forward to. I mean, this is not heaven, folks. It was never intended to be heaven. Oh, it's good. There's good things here. There's wonderful things here. But this isn't heaven. And we want to go toward heaven. How do you account for the seemingly contradictory proverbs contained in Proverbs 26, 4 and 5? Remember what those 2 verses say? One of them says to answer a fool according to his folly. And the other one says don't answer a fool according to his folly. Well, how can you do that? Okay, pick your battles is a good way of saying it, yeah. Don't argue with them, yeah. You know, I said you don't argue with a fool because he'll beat you down to his level and beat you on experience. Yeah, pull you down to his level and beat you on experience. You know, so, you know. I forget which one of them it was. It was famous, I can't remember if it was a president or something. He said, you know, don't want to get, you know, don't get in an argument with a fool because a bystander might not know who's who when you're in the argument. I don't remember which one it was. I just know I didn't say it. I thought that was pretty cool. What it amounts to is this. And that illustrates that a proverb is not true in every circumstance. Sometimes it's okay just to go ahead and give them an answer so they'll be satisfied and walk on. But it's other times you just best not casting your pearls before swine. And don't accept his knowledge is correct. Yeah, there's some people that, and I certainly won't name names, there's sometimes people you hear something and you think, okay, I'm not going to spread this because I want to verify with some other sources before I spread what I just heard. Because, you know, so I've had too many times where I got information where people had it all confused, and I'm reluctant to pass it along because you got to consider the source. Vanity is a recurring word used in Ecclesiastes. The NIV translates it meaningless. Asked to read that section, provide your definition of it. What does vanity mean? Stephen? Of no value, worthless, and a waste of time. I think that's a pretty good description of it. He wrote it? Well, I kind of felt like that sounded a little bit like your dad, but I'd called you on that one time, but I wasn't going to do that again. Yeah, if you don't want the truth, don't ask a kid. Isn't that right? But they're good answers. Your dad does a good job. We'll give him an A. In Proverbs 1:7, what is the meaning of the phrase, the fear of the Lord? Should we literally be afraid of God? Yes, we should be afraid of God. Okay. Explain it, Tom. You said that so emphatically. That's true. Hebrews 10 says that. Yeah. We should fear God in the sense of fearing the repercussions of if we do not obey God. We don't have to cower in fear of God every moment because we're right with Him. Fear is the beginning of knowledge, the Bible says. Yeah, and certainly it is important for us to have a strong reverence for and respect for God. You know, we know you don't take a fork and shove it in a light socket. Why? Why? I got enough electricians in the room. Why didn't you do that? Because we got a healthy respect for electricity, don't we? I like electricity. I really do. I have a healthy enough respect for it to know you don't mess with it. And it's a lot that way with God. We have to have a healthy respect for and follow the boundaries, the laws that God has given us in His Word, because when we go against that, that's when we get zapped, so to speak, to use my electrical analogy. We don't do things that are going to get us zapped, and we don't do things that are against God. We should fear the repercussions and reverence and respect the Almighty God. There's not enough of that in our world today. Yes, sir.
Ecclesiastes 5:5 is another one I think a lot of people have trouble with.
Remind us of that verse.
Don't make a vow to God you don't make.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly.
And that's the first thing you think of until
Right.
it's all over and then you forget about it.
Right, right.
We were having a conversation at the house about an incident that had taken place. My input to the conversation was, I would never be a part of that because I fear God.
Mm-hmm.
No, not because, basically what you were saying, I don't fear Him, respect and afraid.
Yeah.
That would be described as purity, maybe we talk.
Right. Much like Joseph, didn't want to sin with Potiphar's wife, and says, "I don't want to do this and sin against God." He realized that put an affront between he and God. Okay, last question. Proverbs 5:15 through 23 talks plenty about a husband-wife sexual relationship. He uses the term "drinking out of your own cistern," and that is where that comes from. As does the Song of Solomon. Why would God include passages like these in the Bible? Why would God include things like that? Humankind deals with these things. Here's what I want to say about this. God created Adam and Eve, made us the way we are, made men and women different for very good reasons. God chose how new people get brought onto the planet. He chose sexual reproduction for that. God gave us the desires that we have and gave us marriage. It's the first thing God instituted. Gave us marriage and designed that as the proper context for that and the proper context for children to come into the world. And it is a beautiful and a wonderful thing that God gave to humanity. God put it that way, made us that way. And Song of Solomon is a celebration of that married romantic love and just how beautiful it can be. And for that makes it a special passage. Okay? Thanks. And the puzzle, Janet Snyder was our winner tonight. She's in our puzzle. It's in there as Janet's, but I did put a space in it. There's no space in the puzzle, but it's Janet's if you're looking for her name in there. And I have a listing of what I call great passages from the Psalms. Several of them in there, some really good ones, including the one that Andy quotes in the beginning of his sermons in Psalm 122. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." So I had to include Andy's quote in there. So anyway, great things that are there and things to look at.